The issue has been is essentially retrogression. So in the early 2000s, the USCIS kind of caught up. There was kind of bottlenecks earlier in the immigration process. When they caught up, well, now suddenly there were too many people for visas, and so that impacted particular countries where lots of people were coming, and those are notably India, China, and the Philippines. And so that issue is probably been more of an issue in the last 10 to 12 years. Now, when I said, the Philippines is impacted by retrogression too. So you might think, well, wouldn't this be good for Filipinos? Well, the problem is because there's so many Indians in line that even though Filipinos are subject to retrogression in a way that people from, say, Nigeria are not, they would still be pushed back and impacted by this bill.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Does this bill have a sunset provision?
It's a great question. So the bill itself does not have a sunset provision. The bill would make sure that there are no caps based on country indefinitely through the employment-based process. So no more would you have a different lines based on what country you're from. Where there would be a sunset provision, and for those of you who don't know what a sunset provision is, that's where the provision of the bill expires after a certain amount of time, is the nurse carve-out. And so the debate with the nurse carve-out is if we allocate a certain number of visas specifically for nurses, will that last for 6 years or 9 years and then phase out? And those of you who have a longer history might remember the 1990s, they actually created a specific visa for nurses, and that sunset in the early 2000s. So there is a concern if there is a sunset, would that be extended, or would that lapse in a way that would mean that we'd again be in a period where we have a lot of nurses coming over, and then suddenly that stopped because that provision sunsets.
There's a question about, is it possible to share your slides to the PNAA members?
Absolutely. I've sent them to you. I'd be happy to send a PDF that you can share openly. And I'm happy to answer questions as well.
Yes. There was a question as it relates to instead of calling, would we write or email to be more effective? And that is actually what is being sent to the PNAA members for the question whether it's effective to write or email, which is more effective than calling. So we have sent the template. You should be the RVPs and the COPPers and your legislative chair liaison for your region also has those. So yeah, that's basically them.
Absolutely, and I would suggest doing both. I would suggest both calling and using the email comment forms because they track both. Even if you don't actually talk to a staffer in an office, just leaving a message will be tracked. So I would recommend people do both. I think physical mail, given the timeline that we're on, I wouldn't recommend postal mail because that might get there too late. So I would certainly encourage people to use email forms, the contact forms on a lot of individuals' websites. And then faxing or calling is also really useful.
Thank you. There's another question. Are there proposals attached to the bill that is now in the Senate that will address a fair distribution of visas?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Are there proposals attached to the bill that is now in the Senate that will address a fair distribution of visas?
Well, I guess the question is around what's fair mean. This bill is not a comprehensive reform, and even the Believe Act deals with more issues, but it's also not fully comprehensive reform. All the Fairness for High School Immigrants Act does, it says instead of allocating the 140,000 visas and giving no country more than 10,000 or so, we're going to say that we have 140,000 visas, and whoever's been in the line the longest will get them. And most of those people will be Indians. So it depends on whether you think that's fair or not. Some people would say these people have been waiting a long time. It's fair that they get a visa first. Other people would say one of the key things here is having people from different professions, from different backgrounds, who are all adding to the American workforce and the American community. And having one type of worker an individual there does not really further those goals. So whether it's fair or not is a different question, but all this bill would primarily do is eliminate the per country restrictions of the 140,000 visas. It would not affect the number of visas that are available to be allocated.
I see. Here's another question. In case the bill will be passed, is there anything else we can do to repeal it?
I think, well, so once the bill passes, I think it'll be very hard to repeal. This bill has a very strong bipartisan support. Hundreds of sponsors in the House, lots of sponsors in the Senate. It's been very popular. I think the issue would not be full repeal. I think it would probably be one of two things. One is working for for a specific visa category for nurses in the future, so that they're not part of that employment-based pool, or pushing for comprehensive reform that would include, provisions for healthcare professions. Now, both of those, I think, would be very difficult to do practically. So I think the most important thing is either to stop the bill, which is looking increasingly difficult to do, or if we can't stop the bill, making sure it has adequate provisions to ensure that nurses are still able to come over.
Next question is, if the bill removes the cap per country, and since nursing is a highly skilled profession, then recruitment for RNs from the Philippines should become more open and lucrative.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question again, Mindy?
If the bill removes the cap per country,
yeah,
and since nursing is a highly skilled profession, then will the recruitment for nurses, RNs from the Philippines, become more open and lucrative?
So the answer is no. So if you were thinking about it, if you think about retrogression, right, that means there's a line. If you just said, we're eliminating retrogression, and so people can come through quickly, that would be true. Then there'd be a more demand for Filipino nurses, and they'd be able to come over. The problem is, we're not eliminating retrogression. We're just saying retrogression doesn't matter based on what country you're coming from. And so what that would mean is that Filipinos who might have to wait about 2 years now for a green card would have to wait 5 or 6 or 7. And so it would actually become more difficult if this bill passes rather than less. Because while you're limiting the per country cap, you're still keeping the overall cap the same.
Thank you. Before I ask the next question, I just want to let the participants know that there is going to be a meeting with Senator Schumer, with Dr. Marie Ortrelis as our representative for PNAA. I believe also with Bruce Morrison sometime this week. So just FYI to everyone. So the next question is, aside from PNAA, how is this being addressed by other organizations in addition to AHA? If the Alternative Bill Believe Act is considered, how is the ratio determined based on source countries? How is the number determined in terms of anticipated nurse shortage to supplement exceeding nurses, RNs, that are in the pipeline or graduating here in the United States?
Great. Okay. So there's a lot of questions in that one. I guess the first part of that was around the Believe Act, right? So the Believe Act. Sorry.
I just said yes.
Yeah. So the Believe Act is not actually have much traction. It was more establishing kind of an alternative to this Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. It would also abolish the per country cap. So source country would no longer matter if the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act passes or the Believe Act passes. The difference is the Believe Act would increase the number of visas, would nearly double them, so that there's less of an overall weight. So even though we're putting everybody in that one line, well, the line now is doubled in terms of capacity. So that's the first part of it. Now, the second part is, even within that, it exempts nurses. So there's not a question of whether there's a shortage or not, because that's not how it works in terms of calculations. The thing is, the Department of Labor keeps a list. It's called Schedule A. And those are professions where we assume there's a shortage. The current professions on the list are nurses and physical therapists. So if you're a computer programmer, we all know computer programmers are very much in demand, right? But they're not on a list of shortage positions. So for each time a company is applying for authorization for a computer programmer, they have to prove that there's no comparable U.S. employee who can do that work. with nurses and physical therapists, because we assume there's a shortage, we automatically avoid that process. They skip that. So there wouldn't have to be any proof of that. Nursing is in a privileged position where we assume nurses are needed.
I see. Thank you. Why are Indians singled out as the population that will benefit from this bill? Is it possible to have a copy of this present? Oh, I responded to that. So why is it the Indians being singled out to benefit from this bill?
Because of the long line.
Yeah, I don't think it's about benefiting Indians. The issue is that you couldn't copy it. It's not about benefiting Indians. It's about eliminating an obstacle for Indians. So right now, each country gets 10,000 visas or less. That countries like the India, which has 1 billion plus people, China, which has even more, obviously get to that number very quickly, and so they have much longer lines. So this bill wouldn't essentially. It's not about benefiting Indians and saying Indians get special treatment. What it says is that we no longer will have different lines for different countries, and because Indians have such a long line, they're the ones that happen to benefit when you take away that restriction.
I see. Next question. While the Believe Act is not getting that much attention, it seems that it has alternative points. Could we add those to our letters to senators?
Absolutely, you could add them. I mean, I think you have to also consider what you want to say. So there are a lot of provisions of the Believe Act that are important. I would say that the Believe Act does some things about fixing the employment-based program, but the real problem, and most people would say this on Capitol Hill or policymakers and beyond, is the entire immigration system is broken. Everything from employment-based visas to how we treat refugees and asylum seekers, to how we allow people to bring their family members over. The entire system is broken. It's way too expensive. It's way too difficult, and it takes way too long. And so there's a fundamental break here. So you can talk about the Believe Act provisions and how those are important. I can't tell you what you want to include in your letter. I think the more important thing, though, is where are we now? We're in a point where this bill could pass this week. And so we want to make sure that we give our senators the knowledge, because they're not thinking about healthcare when they're supporting this bill. They're thinking about it's not fair that Indians are waiting in longer lines because of what country they're coming from. That seems unfair. They're not thinking, hey, this could really impact the ability of hospitals to get the nurses they need. And so making sure that perspective is standing out, I think, is the most important, at least in the short term. I think longer term, a lot of these other issues need to be addressed, but right now it's just making sure that if this bill passes, that it includes adequate protections to make sure nurses are protected as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, recently, President Trump has announced his intention to get rid of country-based green card limits by introducing merit-based immigration. Would this upset this bill?
No, that's a great question. So the Trump administration thing about merit-based, that's a more fundamental fix of the immigration system, where you would get a point system. And if those of you who know, Canada has a very similar model of essentially assigning points to decide which immigrants can come in or not. It would not affect, this bill would be kind of a precursor. That's a much bigger fix. This one would just get rid of the per country cap. If you had a point system, that would also presumably not have a per country cap. So this is kind of a stepping stone to that. I think the Trump bill is probably not going anywhere right now, because it will require dealing with a lot of the other issues that both the Believe Act are considering and other people are considering, which is like all these people who are kind of trapped in limbo by a broken immigration system.
I see. Next question. If there is no hearing on this bill and there are senators opposing it, what would it take that this bill be defeated? What specific strategy would you recommend other than the letter writing, emails, telephone calls to directly impact?
So I think that's the most important thing right now. Like if you want to say, like, there's not much else because of where we are in the timeline, that's basically it, right? This is not when we have weeks and months to, educate people and talk about issues and craft alternative legislation. That's not where we are right now. We're at crunch time. And so the one thing people can do is hammer out the lesson. And the goal might not be not necessarily to defeat the bill at this point because the bill has so much support. The goal now is to say to people who are on the fence, if you want to pass the bill, okay, just make sure that we have nurses that are protected under it. And so it's saying either we oppose the bill as written, and if it's going to pass, it has to have those protections. I think other kind of strategies make sense in the context of comprehensive immigration reform, and the PNAA letter to senators kind of highlights that really the solution is comprehensive reform. But given where we are right now, we don't need to worry about the longer-term play. We just need to worry about stopping the bill or making sure it has the kind of carve-outs that are necessary.
Okay. 2 more questions. Where can we follow the Senate discussion and the voting?
Great question. So you basically can't, right? Because this bill is being considered a unanimous consent. So it's not like a bill where there's, debate and, people are filibustering and there's hearings. None of that's happening. This is all kind of being done behind the scenes. When I talked about the current status and the caps and stuff, there's no article on that stuff. That's just, my ear to the ground talking to the lobbyists for some of the healthcare staffing firms, the American Hospital Association lobbyists, and saying, these are all the things that are happening right now, but there's no kind of public knowledge. This will happen very quickly when it happens, and so we need to make sure that Senators Perdue and Young and others recognize the importance of staying strong on protecting nurses.
Last question. It's not actually a question, but a suggestion. Can we advocate for Bill HR 1933? HIC visas for nurses. It has passed the House. It's now now before the Judiciary Committee of the Senate.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great bill. And if I was asked to give a discussion by the PNAA of the immigration landscape, I would definitely have talked about that bill. I think it's a great bill. I think it and for those of you who aren't familiar, it would essentially re-implement the nurse visa, which existed in the 90s and then went sunset about 15 years ago. The reason why I did talk about that is because, yes, we should pass that. We should probably pass that whether HR 1044 passes or not, ultimately. But the goal of this webinar was to say that this bill will either pass this week or it won't, and it'll pass with adequate protections for nurses or it won't. And so let's make sure that happens. I absolutely agree that that should be part of the solution. And you can include that in your letter if you want, but the real goal right now is stopping S386 as it's currently written.
I see. Well, those are the questions, Mr. Bakshi, and thank you very much. There is one. Do you have the list of senators who are supporting this bill? This way we can concentrate our efforts to these legislators. Is there a way you can share the AONL position statement on S386?
Yeah, great question. So I don't have that list firstly, but I think certainly some of the other groups that you're working with. I know Bruce Morrison from the American Hospital Association, some of the lobbyists for some large healthcare staffing firms. They're actually on the ground doing the lobbying, and they probably do have a list. The most important thing though is that people contact their senators. That has a lot more impact than contacting other senators. So, I think certainly you could check and see what the difference is, but I would just, given where we are in the process and how time sensitive things are, I would, just call and write my senators regardless of where they are on this bill. The other thing I want to note is that people can support this bill but not recognize the ramifications for nursing. And one of the things that's happened is we've educated people, as people have been thinking, hey, it's not fair that Indians are discriminated against by the current system, as well as Chinese and, frankly, Filipinos, too. But they're not thinking about what the implications might be for certain segments like healthcare. And so making people, even who support this bill, recognize that it's important that it includes a carve out for nursing, I think can be a solution even for people who are already on board for the bill, to make them aware of this potential consequence and potential fix for that consequence.
I see. There is a follow-up comment, and it says, this topic is important to us as Filipino nurses and surely will impact us in the future. So maybe should be disseminating throughout the PNAA community, therefore maybe should be part of our conventions in the national and regional levels. So that's just a comment. Let me ask a question too.
Okay, I'll say one thing. That's a great comment. And I think this is where, you know, not just PNAA, but other groups I've talked to have recognized is on this bill. I think a lot of us were kind of caught off guard, right? You know, because this bill's been going through Congress for the last 8 years. Congressman Yoder, who sponsored the bill in the last Congress, lost re-election. I think a lot of people just kind of said, all right, we take a brief sigh of relief, and it's kind of dead. And because we didn't look at it carefully, they were able to kind of pass it out of nowhere in the House. And so I think what the lesson for us as advocates for nurses is we need to be more proactive about establishing a strategy. And so this means saying, not just fighting this bill now, but thinking about what are the things that we really need to happen to protect nurses in the future coming over. You know, things like H-1C, nurse visa, things like making sure that people have the protections that they need so they're not exploited by their employers. These are all things that we could proactively be discussing, and including those types of policy discussions at PNAA conventions and elsewhere, I think would be very useful, both to crystallize what are the really important things PNAA members believe we should be advocating for, and helping educate legislators and others proactively about the importance of nurses in our positions.
I think that's, well, there's one thing. I read an article about China also opposing this bill. Am I correct? I have a copy of their position statement.
Of who? The Chinese?
China, yes. It's opposing this bill. Yes. There's a letter that is actually sent to the senators that they are opposing this bill.
Yeah, so everybody's opposing the bill because, so if you think about retrogression, Chinese people are subject to retrogression, Indian people are, Filipinos are, because these are all countries with a lot of people coming to the U.S. The problem is, even though Chinese and Filipinos are subject to retrogression, Indians have such a long line that they'll push everybody else back. So even groups like the Chinese and the Filipinos, who have a lot of people here coming here, are worried that even they'll be worse off with this if this cap is lifted without adequate protections.
I mean, it's not China; it's Chinese American who is actually opposing this bill.
Yeah, I mean, it would certainly reduce Chinese immigration as well. It would essentially reduce immigration from everywhere in the world except India because of what the delays look like. If you remember that chart, you know, we're talking about 17 years for the EB3 and 151 for the EB2. That means those people on average will never get there, right? And so that line is so long that it'll push everybody else back from no matter what other country they're from.
Thank you for that. I think we have two more speakers that will speak, and I think Attorney Valera, are you online?
Thank you.
Attorney Valera?
Carol, is he in?
I couldn't find him.
Hello?
Attorney Valera?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Go right ahead. We have 6 minutes till the end of the
Yes, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you for this time. I think the most important thing here to consider with respect to HR 2044 and S386 is, with these laws, Congress will actually end, will actually end immigration of skilled workers in the U.S.
Hello, Attorney Valera. Let me just mute everyone. I will mute everyone first, and then I'll unmute you, okay?
All right. All right.
Go ahead.
All right. So HR 2044 and S386, I wanted you to equip yourselves on some of the basic arguments. Actually, with the passage of this law, if it will pass, will end immigration of skilled workers in the U.S. The reason why Indians are in the equation is because they will take all the visas the moment this is passed, considering this math, for example, for EB2, for high-skilled and advanced degree holders. So there are 550,000 nationals waiting for green cards, of which 512 are Indian nationals. So under this law, if it is passed, aside from the transition period of 3 years, so all the green cards will be taken by the Indian nationals. That's the reason why. So aside from the toughness now of existing immigration law, there are several points why you need to oppose this. Number one, highly skilled workers, healthcare, medical research, two areas of great importance and significance to America, will be shut out from residency for a decade, for 10 years. So potential new Americans in basic science, engineering, for example, physics, artificial intelligence, and even climate change may and will not be able to get the green cards, who are not Indian nationals, because it has to be used up by the Indian national first, considering the backlog that they have. Now, second, the waiting time for residency under these two bills will actually go from 10 years up to 17 years after the Indian nationals use the visas. Third, even if the Indians already backlog will not all get the green cards, there is simply not enough. Fourth, the reason why we immigration lawyers are opposing this as practicing, this legislation would also potentially harm DACA and PPS recipients. So, in other words, this law is a zero-sum game approach. So what we're looking at, this is to equip you, is a system that would make more permanent residency visas available, where healthcare workers like nurses, especially in the rural areas as mentioned, and scientific research are acknowledged as priorities. A system that would encourage skilled workers to remain in the U.S. So in other words, I understand fully the backlog. You have to understand that the per country cap is actually distribution. If you recall, the history of that is that was enacted way back in 1965 to replace the quota system. The quota system explicitly discriminated against all nations outside of Europe, including India. And even within Europe, Italy got far less visas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valera. We're almost 10 o'clock. If you can say your last words.
Yes, of course. So in other words, I just raised those points. Unfortunately, I have no more time, but I think that one of the most important bills now would be the Belief Act, which doubles the number of green cards and ending the ridiculous process of counting spouses and children of highly skilled work allocation visas. So,
thank you very much for that comment, Dr. Valera. That would add to our knowledge. So,
and one more point, to all of you, your survival and existence as an organization does not depend whether this will pass or not. You have a lot of pipelines for recruitment of nurses, but this is a very good handle of advocacy to all of you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Attorney.
Mhm.
So, Vicky, last words, please.
Madeline, just to report to you so far, and to everybody, so far Mindy and I have only gotten less than 10 people who have already written to their senators. We actually have a plan, and this is going to be to find out electronically how many have written to their senators and how many responses have been received. Jenny Aying has actually volunteered to start the tracking Excel file wherein we will know how many people have sent letters to their senators and what responses they have gotten so far. And the new thing that we learned today is it's going to get passed this week. So we don't have time. So this is really something that we need to put our efforts on. And when we get all of those information from Jenny and the other RVPs, Gloria, Ramon, and Laila, it will give Madeline and our board an opportunity to have an analysis of how we have actually advocated for this bill. And today is actually the National Voters Registration Day. So include in your letter that you are a registered voter. Thank you, Mindy. You did a great job.
Okay.
And Amokul, thank you so much. It was really, really great. And Arnedo.
Thank you, Mindy and Vicky. Thank you, Attorney Mukul Bakshi. Thank you, Attorney Valera, and everybody, all members of PNAA and those listening, participating. Please send your letters and call the offices, because sometimes they give a standard response that says, call my office directly. So if you've sent your letter, please reach out to your RVP and tell them that you've sent your letter. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome. Vicky, I know the others are gone, but isn't it like our families and friends can also write, not just the nurses, right?
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Everybody
I
can
think-
write.
I think,
Yes.
yeah, I think we should emphasize that because they might think it's just the nurses.
Yes.
Share your
Totally agree.
letters with non-PNAA members also. Everybody at work.
Correct.
We reach, just everyone know, those who are still in the, we reach 100 participants. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Okay. And meeting for all.
Hi,